Hi there, this is Prague Talk, a podcast from Radio Prague International. I'm Ian Willoughby. My guest this time is Englishman Tom Gross. Tom campaigned for Roma rights and was active in the media in early 1990s Prague. But he'd had some amazing experiences in the city even before joining the influx of young Westerners to Czechoslovakia's new democracy. These included covert deliveries to leading dissidents in the communist period and evidently being in close proximity to some of the world's most notorious terrorists. Tom Gross, today a regular visitor to the Czech capital, shares his stories with me now in this edition of Prague Talk. So Tom, you were one of thousands of Westerners who moved to Prague in the early 1990s. But unlike the vast majority of us, you had already been here earlier. Could you tell us about your first time in Prague?
Yes, it was really quite special in retrospect. My grandmother had, although she was born in East Berlin, she had spent some time in Prague as a student, and she'd fled because of the Nazis. She was Jewish. She wanted to return to see both East Berlin and Prague. She only had one child, my mother, who the relations were a bit complicated. So I, as her oldest grandchild, was very close to her. So she took me with her. We couldn't initially get visas for East Berlin. So we came to Prague when I was about 12, maybe 13, in 1979. And we stayed at the Intercontinental, which was the only nice hotel at that point. It had opened a couple of years earlier, that rather brutalistic modern structure on the river near the Jewish quarter. And it was a very memorable trip. It was the first trip, obviously, to a communist country. It was completely different than what I'd seen before. It was also very empty, the hotel. There were very few tourists. And one interesting thing is I have a very distinct memory of really the only other people at breakfast on consecutive mornings when we were there at the Intercontinental being a kind of rather suspicious looking group huddled together. Some of them looked Middle Eastern. There were a couple of kind of security service types with them or watching them.
Who were these people?
Well, I later discovered that they were almost certainly the notorious terrorist Carlos the Jackal and some Palestinian terrorists. There was a man called Abu Daoud, who was one of the perpetrators of the 1972 Munich Olympics massacre, and others. And I saw photos of them some years later because I was already interested in politics in the Middle East and so on. They rang a bell when I saw photos. Then many years later, I read an article, I think, in The Guardian. Basically, the STB security archives had been opened, and indeed they said that these very people had stayed for some time in that exact period at the Intercontinental. So although I can't be sure, I'm 99% sure that it was indeed them.
Do you know what they were doing here?
In retrospect, I understand. Well, first of all, they were hiding out because they were very wanted by Israel and various other countries where they had perpetrated acts of terror against the citizens of those countries. And I guess they were being given sanctuary by the Czechs. What's interesting is people today who follow international politics know that the Czech Republic is a fairly close ally of the State of Israel. And indeed, it also was at the time of Israel's independence in 1948 when it supplied weapons to Israel in its war of independence in 1948. But what people don't know is that during the communist period, the opposite was true. And the Czechs, like some other communist East European regimes, were very close to, let's call them radical anti-Western terrorists. So I think Yasser Arafat even lived in another hotel for some time. I remember it's one in Prague 6, I believe he lived in for a while. And Abu Nidal, who was another even more extreme Palestinian terrorist, a breakaway from the PLO, who he regarded the PLO as too moderate. So I don't know whether they were just hiding out, they were plotting acts of terror. There is, I should point out, coming from Britain, the Lockerbie bomb. That's the airplane that blew up over the Scottish village of Lockerbie, and Colonel Gaddafi of Libya was blamed for it. We later found out that almost certainly the actual perpetrator was a breakaway Palestinian group based out of Syria, and they used Semtex, an explosive that came from communist Czechoslovakia. So maybe there was a connection there.
Getting back to teenage Tom, your family had some Czech connections also in the UK.
Yes, so my parents were kind of literary figures, and two of the close friends of both my parents was a man called George Weidenfeld, a publisher born in Austria, Lord Weidenfeld, and he was great friends with a woman called Diana Phipps, who was an interior designer, who I knew to be of Czech origin. After the fall of communism, she reclaimed her family name, which was Sternberg, moved back to Czechoslovakia in 1992 and reclaimed her family estate. So Diana Phipps was friends, I don't know how, with Olga Havlova, the first wife of Václav Havel. And Weidenfeld was friends with Karel Schwarzenberg, who later became Czech foreign minister. They knew the Havels, both of them, Weidenfeld and Diana Phipps. They were refused visas to enter Czechoslovakia by the communists, as was my mother. But I, as a young undergrad in 1988 and again in 89, went on holiday to Prague, also Bratislava. I also went to Warsaw and Budapest in the last days of communism, and Diana Phipps and George Weidenfeld asked me to bring stuff for Václav Havel and other Czech dissidents. I brought stuff for them, first of all, some very basic stuff like some books, a pair of Western jeans, some Western glossy magazines, all the stuff you could not possibly get in communist era time. I think I actually bought some lingerie for Mrs. Havel, or possibly Havel's lover. So I met him. He'd just come out of house arrest. I also met Jiří Dienstbier, the old Dienstbier, who later became foreign minister after the revolution. I met the Czech novelist Ludwig Vasilik. This is in 88 and 89. And that kind of drew me to a kind of emotional connection to the Czechs.
And tell us about the practicalities of delivering things to them. Was it all cloak and dagger?
I stayed at the flat of another man whose name slips my memory, and he arranged the meetings, but no, it wasn't that cloak and dagger. I should point out that I also went in 1986 to Moscow and Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, in the Soviet Union, and delivered some stuff to some dissidents there, and that was much more cloak and dagger. I guess I was a bit fearless. I wasn't bringing illegal materials. I was bringing some novels, some jeans, some magazines, whereas in the Soviet Union, I actually brought out some encoded stuff on an old style cassette. It was disguised as a cassette with a label, I can't remember, I think it was Pink Floyd or something, put it in my Walkman, and me and the guy I went with, another teenager, we were incredibly nervous when we were going through Moscow airport, and so after the memory of that, Prague was not so nervous for me.
What impression did Havel make on you at the personal level?
Well, I didn't meet him at any great length then, and I kind of knew who he was. I didn't form that much of a personal impression. I already had an impression of him as a freedom fighter and human rights activist. But I actually met him again a year or so after the revolution. He remembered me, and I was friends with, well, it's not a secret. At that time, he had a lover who later became his second wife, Dagmar Dasha Havlova, and I was friends with her daughter from her first marriage. So I met Havel a couple of times with Havel's later stepdaughter and her mother, and that's when I got to know him better. And, obviously very impressive person. There's one issue, though, that I didn't think he was doing enough on, and that was Roma.
That's one thing I wanted to ask you about. After you moved to Prague in the early 1990s, you became involved in Romani rights, and you say that the new Czech political leaders had what you call gypsy blindness, that their inherent racism was essentially stronger than their liberalism.
Yes. The Velvet Revolution was a great kind of liberal revolution, at least viewed from Britain. And of all the post-communist revolutions, that was the one in Czechoslovakia that we expected most from in terms of liberalism, partly because Havel himself was a great liberal leader. He wasn't a trade union leader like Lech Walesa in Poland. So what I would say is, what I realised is that even people who were liberal on other matters, when it came to Roma or gypsies, as they were more commonly called at the time, there was total racism. And, for example, I went banging on all kinds of doors, including Amnesty International, which are based out of London. The people dealing with the Czech desk in London for Amnesty International were themselves ethnic Czechs who had left some years earlier under communism, and they themselves shared the same racism as, the far right might have done in Czech society. And I was pretty outraged. I should point out one thing. Why was I interested in Roma? My grandfather had helped Roma after World War II. The Roma had also been victims of Nazi Germany, and he was one of the very few people in the 1950s as a young lawyer who helped Roma. So I remember when he was 80 and I was 10 that year, some Roma came and gave him all kinds of gifts and presents and so on. So I always had an interest in the Roma and a kind of soft spot for the Roma. So I was outraged that not only were the Czechs racist, even Havel, he wasn't racist, but he wasn't doing enough, in my view, or speaking out enough. And I felt very strongly about that subject.
Also, this is a slight digression, but you had a connection to George Orwell in that your godmother was Sonia Orwell, who was the widow of the great writer.
Yep. So Sonia Orwell, Orwell's second wife, again was a friend of my parents because, my parents were the heart of kind of literary London. And my mother had worked on a book with Sonia Orwell, editing some of Orwell's manuscripts. Sonia didn't actually have children of her own. Orwell had one son by his first wife, but not by Sonia, who was much younger than Orwell. So that also gave me a very keen sense of human rights because, to get given the set of Orwell books, including 1984 and Animal Farm, by Orwell's widow as a kid, obviously connected me more than I might have been connected. And I think also that initial trip to Prague with my grandmother when I was 12 or 13 opened my whole eyes to what is injustice. It was like going from a colour movie to a black and white movie, from West Europe to East Europe. It was really grim in those days. It was beautiful Prague, but grim and grey and depressed. And yes, I think the Orwell connection also made me, even though I'm not only a human rights person, I also do more fun journalism and entertainment stuff and so on. I had a very keen sense of human rights, both because of the Orwell connection and because of that first visit to Prague.
You worked with Milena Hybšmenová, who was a leading Czech expert on the Romany. What was she like to work with? She was quite well known, I guess, in her days.
So Milena Hybšmenová was before her time. Way back, what had happened is she had set up, after the revolution, the world's first ever department of Roma studies here in Prague at the Charles University. I think she set it up in 91 or 92. And she initially had actually wanted to study Sanskrit and Hindu and so on, and could not get a visa. The Czechs didn't allow her, the communists, to go to India. And then what she realized is the Roma were of Indian origin. They're originally from the Punjab. And she realized that there were linguistic similarities between the Romani language and Hindu. So she was originally a linguist, not a human rights activist. But when I started doing human rights for Roma, and there was almost no one else doing it at that time, none of the human rights groups were interested, I sought out Milena Hybšmenová as the leading linguist, and we went together to North Bohemia and other places to interview Roma. And she wasn't really a political figure. She was a cultural linguist, but she helped me with the human rights campaigns. There were others too who came with us, but she was an amazing person, an inspiration to me. Unfortunately, she died of a car accident some years later, but she was a lovely woman but ahead of her times with Roma. Under the communist period, she handwrote the first ever dictionary between Czech and Slovak and Roma. Even though Roma have lived on Czech territories for 600 years, there was no dictionary till she wrote it in the 1970s.
You also told me earlier that the great Czech photographer Josef Koudelka, who famously one of his series of photographs is of gypsies,
right,
that he accompanied you when you visited the communities.
That's right. So he came with us to Ústí nad Labem, Most, to Plitza and other places. Also, a British film director called Michael Stewart came to make a documentary on what he called the forgotten Holocaust of Czech Roma. I was an assistant on that.
But of course, Prague in the 90s was also a very fun place. And I know you did some things that were rather different from human rights activism. including helping to establish the Czech version of Elle magazine in 1994.
Yes, so I didn't want to just do serious stuff all the time. Prague was so fun back in the early 90s. As you know, Ian, it really was a unique period. So I had also worked for a magazine, actually even before I went to university. I'd worked for Harper's and Queen in London, which was like Harper's Bazaar, and I'd also written some articles for other magazines. And a friend of mine called Anne Caroline Brown, who was working for an advertising agency, she was given a call by a Czech exile who got the license to set up the first glossy magazine in post-communist Eastern Europe, a guy called Antonin Herbeck, who's quite well known now because he set up lots of magazines since. So Antonin was looking for people, and Caroline introduced me to him in Café Slavia. We met, I remember, and he hired me as one of the first two people involved. It took about a year to set up. So in 1994, we had a great launch party at Obecny Dum. It was really fun. I was the special projects editor for the first year and a half. And, you know, it was a bit trial and error, really. And later on, it became a normal thing to have glossy magazines here and everywhere. But it was, you know, this was the era where, for example, the first McDonald's opened in Prague. There was all this Western stuff coming. Everything was novel at the time.
And you were even making music videos.
Well, I wasn't making them, but I was an assistant. So because Prague was beautiful and very cheap, so MTV Europe used to come over to Prague and film videos. And because I was here and I was already knew people, I was kind of fixer for them. I found locations for videos for MTV Europe.
What kinds of places?
Usually I think there were places in Malistrana, some of the kind of back streets near Prague Castle, some of the quiet streets. You know, they wanted kind of cobblestones and an old look and so on, particularly up by the castle near Malistrana. Also, if I might add, Time Out magazine in London started doing guidebooks. I was one of maybe 6 or 7 people who worked on the first edition of the Time Out guidebook to Prague. I think that was also published in 1994. So it was a little bit schizophrenic. I was doing some very serious work on human rights. I was banging at the doors of the UN, Amnesty International, the Czech government, because what happened is, I should just say, is when Czechoslovakia split on the 1st of January 1993, about 3 days earlier, between the Christmas and New Year period, the Czechs rushed through the citizenship law, which basically was designed to make it very hard for any Roma of Slovak origin to get citizenship in the new Czech Republic, because, of course, a lot of Roma had been moved after 1948, when the Sudeten Germans were expelled. They were moved from eastern Slovakia to the housing in West and North Bohemia.
But weren't almost all the Romanis in the Czech Republic, Czech lands, were Slovak after World War II, right?
Yeah, because the smaller Czech community were murdered by the Nazis. They were at Lety concentration camp. I also campaigned on that because the communists had turned this small concentration camp into a pig farm. You cannot imagine anything more insulting. So I and others campaigned to stop it being a pig farm. And whereas in Slovakia, or in the war, Tiso had been the fascist leader of Slovakia. Although he was a terrible anti-Semite and almost all Slovak Jews were murdered, he didn't murder Slovak Roma. So that's one reason why the communists redistributing populations after the war, having expelled the Germans, shifted a lot of Roma. So the people being stripped of citizenship were often their children or grandchildren. Anyway, in the end, they weren't stripped. Again, I had political connections. I got hold of a US congressman called Tom Lantos, a Hungarian Jewish Holocaust survivor who was also sympathetic to Roma. He was a Democrat. He and someone called Benjamin Gilman, who was a Republican, together wrote a bipartisan letter to Václav Klaus, who was then the Czech Prime Minister, on behalf of the US Congress, telling them to push back on their citizenship law to allow Roma to have citizenship. I helped draft that letter for them, and I like to think that played a role in the Czechs revising their citizenship law.
Well, Tom, jumping forward decades from that time, today you don't live in Prague full-time, but you are here quite often. How do you find being here now, all these decades later?
I left living full-time already by 1995, but I've been coming and going ever since. I have a wonderful daughter here, so I'm here for her. look, Prague has normalised. You wouldn't necessarily know it was a post-communist country. It's probably found its natural place in Central Europe rather than communist East Europe. It's more similar in some ways to Vienna or Munich than it is to countries to the east. It's, a successful city. It's, less exciting, I have to say. It hasn't got that vibrant feel of post-communist exhilaration, really post-revolutionary exhilaration. It's still as beautiful as ever. But, capitalism has triumphed for better and worse. And it's kind of settled down, Prague, a bit like I have, because I'm no longer the young person, or you, Ian. I know you've also been here since the early 90s, so maybe Prague has grown up just like yourself and myself have grown up.
Many thanks indeed to Tom Gross for sharing those wonderful stories, memories and insights. I spoke to Tom at our studios in Vinohrady in November 2024 for Prague Talk, a podcast from Radio Prague International. If you're a first-time listener to the pod and enjoyed our chat, why not look up some of the over 100 earlier editions and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. That's all for this episode, so from me, Ian Willoughby, thank you so much indeed for listening to Prague Talk, and talk to you again very soon.